All right, welcome everyone. My name is Courtney Brown and I'm a first-year MBA student at MIT Sloan. I am pleased to introduce the football analytics panel today. Our guests are John Urschel, offensive lineman for the Baltimore Ravens and MIT PhD student. Brian Burke, senior analytics specialist for ESPN. Sandy Wheel, director of sports analytics for Kroenke Sports and Entertainment. Bill Barnwell, staff writer for ESPN.com. Thomas Dimitroff, GM of the Atlanta Falcons. And our panel will be moderated by Mike Reese, Patriots reporter. The panel will run for 45 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of question and answer. Please tweet your questions to the hashtag football analytics as well as SSAC16. We'll be choosing the tweets that are most mentioned and retweeted for questions after the panel. Without further ado, I'll give it to Mike.
Thank you, Courtney. It's great to be here. We have a lot of passion and a lot of energy for what we do. We're excited to share it with you. We think we have a great game plan here for the next hour. John, we were initially going to put you in the middle so you could be our center. You know, like 7 games started for the Ravens last year. Did a great job. Hope you're okay on the end of the line here, you know.
I think I'll manage just fine.
You're a versatile player.
He's making great tackle money over here.
Yeah. That's right. And these chairs are wide for you. I could fit like 2 of myself in here.
I appreciate
but I think I'll just sort of wiggle my way up here. All right, so I want to start. I want to hear from each of you just to ask the question, get the discussion started. What are analytics to you? And the reason I want each of you to answer it is that we're all going to look at it maybe from a little bit of a different perspective. So Thomas, I'll start with you, and then we'll just go right down the line. The question, what are analytics to you?
Analytics to a general manager in the National Football League. Okay, analytics they confirm, they juxtapose, they justify, they're very, very opinionated. They're honestly a pain in the ass at times. And in the end, I would summarize it as it's like a trusted assistant. Right? They provide all this information and they're there for you when you need them. They don't make the final decision, but they're there for you, and they're a very important part of where we are in the National Football League today.
Take it away, Bill.
I think from a journalistic perspective, and I think you can probably back me up on this, Mike, my football background's not Thomas's background or John's background. These guys are experts in a way that I'll never be an expert. So just in terms of wanting to have evidence for what I'm saying or a basis for finding some factual statement in what I'm trying to write and report, analytics are incredibly important in just providing evidence. And I think that's really what I think of when I think of the word analytics. It's not a number or a quantitative basis. It's not a stat. It's very simply just evidence for a point that I'm trying to understand, or what helps win football games, or what helps explain why a team won or lost a given game or did well in a given season. That's really the heart of what analytics are for me.
Sandy?
I would say as an analyst, analytics is about questions. It's about asking questions, asking the right questions, and answering those questions, and usually interrogating the data you have available to answer those questions. How can the data that I have inform the question that Thomas wants to know about, or that that the head coach wants to know about? So you can't always answer those questions, and sometimes you have to, and as a good analyst, you want to make sure you're keeping track of, well, what are the assumptions, and trying to figure out which assumptions are important to let somebody know about, and which ones are just, all right, well, I know those are there, that they asked me about them. I know what they are.
And Brian, before you answer, we should mention to everyone that you're wearing your Broncos-colored tie.
Yeah.
You mentioned to me that explain your sort of game plan here coming into the conference.
I overthink this. So I'm grateful to Daryl and Jessica for inviting me back past few years. So each year I wear the Super Bowl champions colors. So first year I was here, purple and black. So what is analytics to me? So analytics is what I do. And if you don't do what I do, then it's not analytics. That's how I define it. And I think it's a more rigorous version of what everyone does every day. So you have some observation about the world. I'm going to get deep on everybody. You have some observation about the world, right? Plato's cave, all that. And you have a model in your head somewhere of how the world works. And that observation passes through this model. And at the end of the process, there's some kind of judgment or insight that's gained. And you have to, the whole point is to improve a decision. So if there's no decision at the end of the day, it's a waste of your time. So I see it as this chain from observation all the way through to improving a decision and or asking a question. So as Sandy said, a question, right? The same idea. And so that process is analytics to me.
Now, John, from the player's perspective.
I don't know if I can give the player's perspective, but I will give the mathematician's perspective. I think analytics, thank you.
There you go.
I think analytics is at its heart just applied mathematics. It's taking a quantitative view of something and trying to see what is at its core, what is at its root, whether this is implicit or explicit. Naturally, us being more explicit.
Sure. Now, the word is thrown out a lot, analytics. You know, Sandy, I'll start with you. I mean, what is and what isn't analytics? Because I'm sure you probably hear a lot of people talk about it, and you say, that's not analytics.
You know, I'm not exactly sure. The one thing I do know is that analytics is not always stats, right? Like people think like, oh, you do stats, right? Oh, stats is, you know, it's batting average and yards per carry and, you know, points per game and things like that. And like that is describing something, and you know, it could be analytics. It could be that you had to do something like that. But like what we do is not just stats. And I think that's sometimes a misconception. People, you know, like, oh, this is what you do. Oh, you do stats. You look at these things, and like that's not necessarily it.
Yeah, and I think the flip side of that is that not all numbers are inherently analytics either.
Right.
In that, you know, just because there's a number attached to something, it doesn't make it quantitative or rigorous or empirical. You know, it can just be interesting, and usually not interesting. You know, it can be arbitrary and incredibly useless in terms of actually figuring out or answering a question. And so I think there is a sort of replacement of the term analytics for any and all numbers, and that's equally false.
Yeah, and I think the thing, you know, as a writer, the thing that you know, your job is to put you know, information into a context, right? And analytics, like if a number has no context, it doesn't mean anything, right? 3.2.
That's a good number. I like that.
Yeah. My job is to get
good.
clicks.
Go with that.
I don't know if you know how writing works.
Yeah, no, okay. Well, we're all measured by
pages.
different measures. It's okay.
So one of the questions we get a lot is, you know, give me an example of how analytics helps an organization make a successful decision. So I'm going to give you one that I pulled out, and I want to get your feedback on it. This is John Robinson, the Tennessee Titans general manager, and he was with the Patriots for many years as a director of college scouting, went down to Tampa Bay as assistant general manager for 2 years, and he was on the radio in Nashville, 104.5 FM, and he was asked this question, and I highlighted his answer, and I'm going to read it to you. And he was talking about his time with the Patriots in 2013, scouting a player named Logan Ryan, a cornerback out of Rutgers. And this is what John Robinson said in this interview with Paul Kuharski. He said, quote, "I liked him as a player skill set-wise. I thought he would be a contributor, part-time starter. I did a breakdown of him and 4 or 5 of the other defensive backs that were in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th round projected area, and he was the top disruptor on the ball. Caused fumbles, pass breakups, interceptions. I did an Excel document and a heat map with numbers and kind of did a ranking with weighted values. It really just kind of crystallized my opinion of the player." Now, Logan Ryan, 3 years into his career, has 30 passes defended, 11 interceptions, and you might look at that as an example of confirming what he thought of the player. Is this common? Is this just scratching the surface? Is this a good example when we talk about analytics? Take it, Thomas.
I think, you know, I know John well, and I think John has a good mind and a creative mind, and I think it is scratching the surface. I think there are so many aspects to analytics for us as team builders and decision makers. I think it goes beyond, let's just say, player acquisition is huge, right? It's a massive part of our success in the league, as is in-game decision making. I think the idea to juxtapose players has always been on our radar. How do we truly do that? Instead of just looking at it, comparing 5 linebackers and saying, on my heart, this guy's who we should go after. It's now evolved to a spot where we are becoming more scientific and obviously mathematical about it, making decisions instead of just sort of flippant decisions about how we're going to acquire, and we're trying to dig down on more specifics. Now, I would say that John's approach there has to do with pre-acquisition, right? It's about making sure that he's picking the right player. We are administering many different aspects of analytics into post-acquisition, into cap and contracts, into cap and contract decisions, into game day decision making. So that's just scratching the surface, and I think as we continue to narrow down on what we think is going to differentiate between the player, we are trying to quantify that as well. So very quickly, we analyze every player, and we have a number of specifics to evaluate the player on. Instead of, again, just looking at it on film and deep down saying, I think this guy does this better than this guy, how are we truly going to quantify that? You only get better at what you measure. You all know that. And we're trying to be a lot more open-minded about that in the NFL than we have been in the past.
Go ahead.
Well, let me deconstruct that. So it sounds like if I'm reading an article, I'm a fan. I'm like, oh, okay, the Titans are into analytics now, but I'm going to tear this apart.
All right, tear.
All right. So, number one, he said Excel chart with weighted values. Excel's fine, but what are the weights? Where did he get the weights? The weights are arbitrary. So, as an analyst,
Likely.
I would...
There's an assumption there.
Okay, I've assumed that. You want to bet?
No.
But
Well,
so
what
where?
are
Okay, so the question is, where do the weights come from?
Right.
And did he also do that same chart for all the potential cornerbacks that are available in the draft or otherwise, and make the comparison? Or was it just simply an exercise in verification, what he already wanted to do? At first glance, it sounds very analytical and encouraging, but once you kind of start looking under the hood, maybe not so much.
Yeah.
Hold on now. If you're doing some analysis of, say, some player, any sort of analysis you do, you make some axioms, some assumptions you take to be true. Let's suppose that this is a good predictor, that's a good predictor. If you're optimizing the right things, then based on your construct, you're going to get the correct answer. And the question isn't, is this answer right or not? The question is, what assumptions have you made? What do you think is valid? What do you think isn't? And I think the biggest thing wrong with what you read is not, looking at what assumptions did this guy make. This is an anecdotal example, right? This is anecdotal at best, and this is something that's tough about football analytics that isn't so tough for baseball or for basketball. When you look at football analytics and say, hey, does this work? Doesn't this work? The sample size is so small, you can't go to a coach and say, hey, we're going for it on 4th down more. Look at the results from this year. It's obviously better. The sample size is too small. There's too much randomness. And you have to say, hey, look at these math equations. Look at these things we did. Look at what we analyzed in expectation is going to be better.
Yeah. Well,
and that's a problem.
The thing I would add about this is again, we don't know, we haven't seen his spreadsheet, we don't know what he's done with it. But the first question I always ask when somebody's like that, okay, he's got 23 disruptions or whatever they're called, right? Well, what denominator is he putting that number on top of? And that, I think, good advice to analysts everywhere. It's you've got a numerator, what's your denominator? Is it the number of times he was in coverage? Is it the number of times he was targeted? Was he targeted a lot? Maybe he's targeted a lot for a reason, right? And maybe he's playing in the Big 12 where they're passing, they're throwing, 100 passes a game or some crazy number like that, right? Is he a boundary corner or is he a field corner? What do we want in our scheme? Then that's where analytics, if done right, can inform the scouting department. The scouting department knows, well, he's a boundary corner and he's got the skill set we want, and we want to play press man, and this guy seems like he can, and by the way, he's productive. And the scouting staff knows he's productive because they can count those things, but we can say, actually, he's exceptionally productive relative to the right compared universe. And that's where the denominator and figuring out the universe. And then even then still, all we know is this is descriptive. We don't know if this is predictive. Is he going to be a good NFL player or not?
Right.
I got to look at a bunch of guys.
I think this is really asking the wrong question. This question isn't, are guys who disrupt a lot of passes good NFL cornerbacks? The question is, Logan Ryan's good, right? And then it's using, this quantitative data to confirm that belief. And that's really, it might be right or wrong, but it's confirmation bias. It's starting with the perspective of Logan Ryan is good because I think he's good, and then it's using data to back that up. And it's good to use data for sure. That's really valuable and that can be meaningful, but you really kind of have to ask that first question of are disruptors predictive? Do they have value? Is that a long-term useful skill? And I think that gets to John's point in that there's so much noise in that data that it's hard to actually use that as a meaningful predictor of future NFL performance.
Like Brian, I think it's important to understand, as a decision maker, right, we're trying to get all the information we can so that when we are deciding to spend $9 million on a center, that we're doing the right thing, right? And so, eventually, right?
Oh, that's tampering.
Is that tampering?
I don't know.
$9 million.
Only till I pointed this direction.
I'll take that.
Yeah, I'll take 8.5. I'm a free agent right now, so.
But I think the big thing is to make sure if there's anything that can help, you mentioned it, confirm. Some of this may look flowery and it may look scientific for someone, for a quote, and that's not John because that's not his style. Mm-hmm. I know John, again, he's not just doing that to say that he's using analytics. I think for people to make decisions and to make strong decisions in our league, we're going to have numbers. We have certain numbers for the secondary, defensive backs, that we think is imperative for them to be successful. And as we do linebackers, as we do
production numbers or measurables?
What's that?
Production numbers or measurables?
Production and measurables.
Okay.
I mean, it's amazing what we come up with. So when our analytics people come up and hand me a doc on the defensive ends and why we should or shouldn't go after a certain defensive end in free agency, it helps me make that decision. It's, again, as I mentioned, my definition, it's both sides of it. It works when it works, and it works when it doesn't work, right? When I don't want to go after the guy, or as an organization we don't want to go after the guy, we will make those numbers work for us, to be honest with you, so that I can justify to Arthur Blank, the co-founder of Home Depot, who has a lot of money and is helping us out a lot, what we're doing is the right thing to do. Right. That's a big thing.
Yeah, and I would say that, the good organizations are the organizations, the guys who find themselves in chairs like Thomas's, like, they got there because, well, they know how to listen to this scout and this scout and this scout and this scout, and, hear the things they hear there and with their own eyes, understand, well, what that guy, way he tends to land, well, he tends to like small school guys, it's just who he is, and adding a couple more voices to that room of, well, here's what Sandy thinks of this guy, and here's what this model thinks of this guy, and here's what, the medical staff, he's already integrating 18 different sources in his, draft meetings. Now it's 20 or 21,
And John mentioned, the other sports as well, not just football, sort of comparing, how the data is used. Sandy, I'd actually be curious your perspective of this because you're not just football here. What do you see from the way it's used football-wise compared to maybe some other sports?
It's a good question, and every sport's got its own different places where you need to look at stuff. Like, where do you have sample size enough to actually do anything useful? We don't have good sample size for play counts for players. But what we do have good sample size for? There's 300, 400 prospects every year who come into the league. So if you have some data on all those guys, like, you can do something like in the NBA draft, there's 60 guys drafted a year, right? That doesn't get us out of the second round. And how many of those guys actually are like real prospects every year? Maybe it's 20, maybe it's 30. Like, it doesn't take very many players when your careers are 10 and 12 years. Brian Scalabrine was remarking how he had a 12-year career, doesn't know how he got to a 12-year career. It's like, if you're a good enough player to play in the NBA, you can play a long time because you don't have, the career-ending injury risk is just not the same. And so, but at the same time, I've seen good basketball models, and they're for amateur players, and they're way more predictive than the football ones. Like, they just you can use stats in basketball to project who's going to be a likely good player, and it's pretty hard to do that in football. And
in football, right, the sample sizes are very low. So for individual teams or individual players, you can't do what teams can do with basketball and baseball with so many repetitions, iterations. But you can make global observations and have global insights in league as a whole. Like it's usually, not always, a bad idea to trade up in the first round. So the numbers really kind of scream that at you. It really takes it really takes a very special a special eye for talent to be able to do that successfully. But you can make global observations like that. So the in-game decision analysis stuff. Yeah, I don't have 1,000 samples on your team or your team against this other team, but I do have the league as a whole. So we can make rules of thumb. We can make kind of global insights, and as a starting point.
Is this the time I'm supposed to ask you to follow up what you think of Julio Jones as a player?
It was real good.
Yes.
That was 21 spots, right? That was a big move. I understand. We could go into discussions about that, but no, it's a good point. I mean, we do use, when we went into the Julio Jones analysis. I mean, it was a big research project on trying to figure out what fourth rounders truly mean to the league, because obviously that was a big part of our compensation, 2 fourth rounders in the next 2 years. And I think that was an important part of it. But you can argue it back and forth whether you should move up or not. 8 is not 21 spots, I understand that. It's maybe a once in an organization's lifetime that you'd make a move like that.
We talked about the different, pre-acquisition usage of analytics with the Logan Ryan example, and Thomas, I think you mentioned, contractually some stuff that you're using some of that as well. Can we get deeper into that?
Just on contracts, our cap and contract decisions, we do a lot of analyzing when it comes to, okay, how does our pro personnel department rank all the centers in the league? So in our recent decision to go after Alex Mack, I mean, for us, that was a big decision. It was to provide continued confidence for Matt Ryan, for the entire offensive line, and an offense that last year we were up and down. We figure that Alex is a really good addition for us. We paid a lot of money, and we believe that. What we end up doing for any player that we're acquiring is we compare them financially. We compare them, their contract numbers, their average per year, their guaranteed numbers, their 3-year cash, whatever it may be. We are stacking all of our players and making a decision. And then we are going back and deciding on how productive these players have been that we're actually slotting the projected player that we're going to acquire. We end up going back and comparing their production, their next contracts, their injury rates. There are just so many aspects to how we compare and come up with a final decision whether we want to pay $9 million plus for a position, for a player at a certain position. That is helpful for me at so many levels, because it just, again, when you have an owner asking, is this worth our investment, you're able to come up with something a lot more than just, again, old school, I just know it, I just feel it, there's something about this guy.
It brings us to sort of the perspective I'd like you to bring on. How is this being received in your organizations, that you work for? Are we seeing more acceptance of this? How is it growing? Who's pushing it? Whether it's from the media perspective or the team perspective. Sandy, maybe lead us off here. I mean, what are you seeing in that area?
I think that globally, generally, yes, it's more accepted than it was 2 years ago and 4 years ago and 8 years ago. There's no doubt. I think there's no doubt about that. I think, it really depends a lot on, where's the buy-in coming from, because some people are more bought in than others. When I often use the term, like, there's people who are interested in analytics, and there's people who are engaged in analytics, right? And they could be different people, right? Like somebody, like, I'm interested because I think it's going to make our team better, but I don't need to see how sausage is made, right? So there's people like that, and that's fine too, right? If somebody is interested and they think it's going to help make them better, but like, where does it come down from? And the 2 organizations I've been with, the owners are making a strong commitment to it. They believe from their background, based on their previous experience in their business. I mean, these guys became billionaires for reasons, right? They know how to build a business, and they look at it and say, this makes good sense. We think we should do some of this, and then, they make a commitment, and then who in the organization because the owner's not there, all that, sometimes the owners are there, some owners are there more often than others, but they're not the person who's supervising you, right? So, who is it that you're reporting to? Is it the general manager, assistant general manager, and how interested and engaged are they? And I think that, as teams have more success and, the people, and I think as more people, come up through the ranks who had when they were a personnel intern sitting there late nights, and the analytics intern is there late nights too, and they spend their time talking late nights, standing in the door. The best conversations in the football buildings are at between like 9 and 11 at night, where people are standing around in somebody's doorway, and everybody knows they probably ought to go home, but they probably got a little more work to do, but and you just stand around and you're just chatting about stuff. And what do you think of this player? What do you think of that player? And when the analytics guy and the young scouts, people are having those conversations, they're building rapport, they're building comfort with scouting and with analytics. And so as those people become college directors and pro directors and pro personnel and GMs, like they're gonna, well, of course, that's my guy. He's one of my guys, and so it's growing.
Bill, how about from your perspective, from where you started, working Football Outsiders, now at ESPN.com. How have you seen this sort of grow?
I mean, just, I think there's people seeing it working in other sports. I think there's it's such an obvious part of baseball now. We just saw the comments from, who was the baseball player? Goose Gossage, where he was like, these nerds are ruining baseball. And it was like, that happened so frequently 10 years ago, and it's kind of like, oh, here's this comically out-of-touch old man with a weird mustache saying this now, where it's like that's so obviously wrong and inaccurate, because every baseball team has an analytics department and an analytics presence. Basketball, I mean, we've seen it at Sloan. 10 years ago, the basketball panel was much more open, and now it's people saying, I don't know that I can really talk about that so much.
Did they say anything this morning?
I can't comment on that. But, and I think with football, I think now, because it's working in other sports, I think you have owners like Stan, who are, I'm not on a first name basis with Stan Kroenke, I shouldn't act like that, with your boss, where it's like, they're seeing Arsenal invest heavily in sports science. They're seeing, the Nuggets have had an analytics presence for a long time off and on. There's that cross-pollination, so I think even if there's not the obvious football sort of impetus for it, I think you're seeing more and more teams at least be interested and open-minded to it. And the reality is, like, and I think you might know this better than I would, but I think with football, there's such a sense of keeping up with the Joneses, right? Like, you don't want to be the team left behind. Even if it's something that ends up not being useful, you would at least want to be on the cusp of it and have the information and data and understand it, and at least have a sense of not losing and not having, not ceding a competitive advantage to some other football team because of it.
We like teams that just check the box, though. That's good. Well, it's good and bad, actually. There's some, if a team thinks they have analytics and they don't have it, they're not doing it right for whatever reason, like there's career risk for us, because like now those coaches think that's what it is. And now they're going to go to the next organization and be like, that was bull. Like, I'm not believing that stuff. And now it's like, you're fighting an even more uphill battle, because now they've seen it not working or not being productive, or somebody coming in too hot and standing on the table for things they shouldn't be standing on the table for.
We had an interesting discussion backstage before coming on, and we were talking about, ratings. John, you were the 14th rated, interior lineman,
He's way better than that.
Last year. So enlighten us on your view of these rankings.
So if we're talking rankings, we can just call it what it is. We're talking Pro Football Focus. And from my opinion, if they rate me well, they are great predictors, and I think they are top-rate people. If they rate me poorly, well, they're idiots, amateurs, and let's leave it to the professionals. And that's my professional take on it. Yeah.
How are those numbers influencing, what we're doing here?
Well, I love Pro Football Focus. Congratulations to them. And it's innovative. It brings a whole different dimension of analysis to fans, but it's the fans that are really doing the analysis, right? So I see it's data, it's input to me. It's not really analytics. It's not that full life cycle, that full process. It's an input to something else I might be able to use as analytics. So when I started talking about like a model of the world, I say, well, okay, John is a plus 1.5 center. Okay, so how many wins does a 1.5 center bring to a team? Is it purely additive? Are there interactions with other linemen? And then, okay, take it the next step. How much money should I offer a 1.5 lineman? $9 million a year, I heard, is the.
I think that's about right.
And so it's really just kind of the beginning. It's an input. It's data to further analysis. But it's I don't. One of the things we mentioned backstage too in this discussion was that. Everybody has their own definition of what analytics is, and it can be a very narrow definition. So many front office guys, or maybe some coaches, and you can get this sense just by listening to how they respond to questions about analytics. They might just have Pro Football Focus, or they may just have DVOA and Football Outsiders in their head as representative. And so they can dismiss the whole movement, the whole approach, just because maybe this one approach doesn't work for them.
I think that one of the biggest problems with rating players is, a plus 1.5 or a minus 1 is it's rating how they did in the outcome of some play, but different players have different roles on different teams. And what one team may ask their center to do could be completely different than what other teams are asking their centers to do in terms of having chips and pass protection. Certain teams, whether you're in a 3-4 division or you're in a 4-3 division, this affects directly how good your center looks in pass protection, I believe.
And it's sort of a self-confirming thing, right? Where like with Alex Mack, for example, you're going to ask him to do a lot more than you might have asked, Joe Hawley, or you might have asked Peter Kahns, because Alex Mack's a better player than that. You can ask him to do more and expect him to do more, and it's going to be a tougher job for him relative than it would be for a lesser player. So it's almost like this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Where it's like, Alex Mack's going to have a tougher job, so he might not look as good, even though he really is a better player.
We were also talking behind about the reality of Pro Football Focus and how what is written about a player or a group of players, i.e. an offensive line, that there's management, it's a good thing when it's good, and then it's a bad thing when an owner's calling you saying, wait, PFF said that you guys aren't worth a crap, and how do you justify that? And then we go to our analytics people and we say, all right, now here's where you make your money. Help me out here, okay? So it's an interesting. We enjoy PFF as well, and we think there's some beneficial aspects to it.
I mean, the thing that I would add on them is, they're famous for their grades, and rightly so, because they're the only people. They're basically the public scouting department, right? And so all the writers who don't have a football background, who aren't breaking down tape and watching the last 4 games of this guy's play and watching everything and having some idea about their scheme, what they're trying to do, it's a place where you can go to get something. But as an analyst, I'm a customer, because you know what? They provide grades, and that's about 1% of the value that we extract from their data feeds, because they're providing a whole lot more information that nobody else is providing us about, who was lined up where, what were the defensive techniques people were using, what were the splits, was it a 3-by-2 or a 4-by-1 formation, and how much time did the quarterback have to? They're getting all that stuff too, and so that provides so much. That's 99% of the value we get out of that is probably from that, and the grades are they're kind of a nice to have piece, but they're not. They're sexy, but I don't see them as the driving the value part of the equation, at least for us.
Right, and from a journalistic perspective, I mean, it's a really easy crutch to go to. I don't use their grades. I don't think they're very helpful, and I think that it's really easy to rely on that, because when I'm writing a column and I'm writing about an offensive lineman, I don't get to watch 16 Ravens games a year. I'll watch a few, maybe a couple years ago I watched more. They were a little more exciting than they were last year. Not your fault, but I'll watch some more. But I'm a layman. I don't know what the protection call was on the play. I don't know what an interior lineman's responsibility was on the play, and especially over a course of a few hundred plays, that's impossible for me to gauge. Now, I'm lucky in that I can call, an offensive line coach or a quality control guy and say, okay, well, what do you think of this guy? What have you seen from what you've seen on tape? What do you know about him? And get a basis on it from that perspective. But if I didn't have that, I would probably go out and say, listen, this rating site says this guy's a good guard. Sure, why not? I don't know any better.
And we don't need it because we have a pro scouting department.
Yeah.
Exactly. We have scouts who are paid to do that.
Yeah, so I don't think it comes from a place of being disingenuous, but I think it's just so difficult and so easy to rely upon that it becomes gospel in a way that I think I'm uncomfortable with.
Yeah.
John, can you share insight as to how you're graded? Like when you go into that offensive line room and your coach talks to you, does he say, hey, John, nice job, you were a plus 1.5 today, give us a feel for what that's like when you're in that room.
Naturally, we watch the film. We discuss things that I did very well, where I completed my job for a certain play, or I helped, say, open a hole up. We looked at things where, for instance, in a given week, we go through our game plan, but then we also go through some exotic things that the defense might give us. And we focus on a couple things and we say, hey, these are things the defense does that gives us trouble and gives our protection trouble. We need to recognize these things. If I recognize these things, this is good. If I don't, we need to go back and look and say, why didn't I recognize this? Or if I have some struggle on a certain play, what's wrong with my technique here? It's not so much grading by the numbers. This is for the coaches to do. This is for the people above us to do to make decisions. But in terms of me as a player, it's just very much looking at what I did well, what I didn't do well, and what I need to do for the rest of the week to make sure I perform better next week.
So we've been talking about buy-in, organizations, how they view analytics. Here's the thoughts of Bill Belichick on how he views analytics. He was asked this question within the last couple of months, and his answer was, it is what it is. Oh, actually, I'm sorry, that was something else. I had that in the back of my head. That's how he usually answers my questions. So he was asked, how much have you seen the use of analytics grow in football over the last several years, and what can they be useful for? And this was Bill's answer to Ben Volen of the Boston Globe. He said, it's not really a big thing with me. We do some of it. I'm sure we do a lot less than what other people do. It's not really my thing. And then he goes on and he says, look, I've done these things all the way back to when I was with the Giants and before, just doing them by hand. But if you're out there coaching every day, to me, if you can't see an 80% tendency, then what are you looking at? Now is it 51-49, 49-51? I don't know. What are you going to do with that? Do you want to bet on 51? Do you want to bet on 49 or bet on 55-45? At that point, what's the difference? I don't see a big difference. And then he sort of goes on. So he's really dismissive of it. So I want to ask you, are you buying? What are you selling there?
I'll take this one to start. So just because he says something doesn't mean something is so. I think we've learned this over time. And secondly, assuming that what he is saying is true, this just goes back to implicit versus explicit analytics. Regardless, this guy is a master of implicit analytics. And therefore, we should not say this is a guy who's not using analytics, but this is a very veteran guy who has gathered lots of data through his experiences, and his computing system is just his head. This is what we're trying to do. We're trying to take data, and we're trying to learn from it. He's learned a lot over his years, and even if he's not using explicit analytics, he's taking some set model that he's adjusted through the things he's seen and the results he's gotten. Yeah. Going back to what Brian's
his models are wetware, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. And I would say the thing I always come back to on football is that football has probably the longest history of analysis, right? It's just hasn't been formally quantitative for most of the life of football. Bill Belichick tells stories about the, stacks of plays with the holes on the sides and the ice pick method for, all right, how do we, that's just filtering, right? Like that's what they use in Exos now, and they punch in, I want to see all the first down plays in this part of the field, and they line up like this, and he put an ice pick through. I don't exactly know how it works, but you can read it online in a couple spots, and like the cards that are left on the ice pick are the ones that you look through. And so he was doing that in the 70s, right? That's analytics. It's just not using a computer, right? That's still the same stuff.
Yeah, and I think it's really a semantic thing. And the classic example we always hear is whenever you watch a Patriots game and there's a punt, you always hear, Belichick loves left-footed punters, right? Because the ball comes off their foot differently. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I would guess it's probably true because Bill Belichick's a lot smarter than I am. And like he's gathered that empirically over the course of 40 years in the game. And that's not, I don't think he was ever in Excel with a heat map, gathering numbers from Pro Football Reference like I would do it. But he's studied punters, and he has an empirical basis for saying that. And I really think there is a lot of, I think that's analytics in a way that maybe Belichick isn't thinking of the term analytics when he's answering that question.
I'd like to go on record for saying that it's heresy to disagree with Bill Belichick in the National Football League. Start first of all. That said, I think, as I've mentioned, there are changes, and some of the new head coaches, i.e. our head coach in Dan Quinn, and it's not all chronological, obviously, but here's a guy in his mid-40s who has a really adept feel for scheme and coaching and leadership. And he's, again, open-minded to supplement with all the analytics, whether it's athletic performance, which is a big thing in our league right now, and there are so many different directions we could go in that discussion. I think the league has changed where many, many years ago, I've been in 27 plus years or whatever it has been, and early on, I feel like back then, my take on it was we were intimidated by, we all are, not intimidated, that's the wrong word, but we were challenged, and maybe there was an element of intimidation by what we didn't know. We held on to our jobs as scouts, and we didn't want the measurements out there because it may indicate that, that Southeastern scout with the Detroit Lions back in the early 90s wasn't doing his job or whatever. So we always fought that, I felt, years and years ago. Now we realize with the demystifying of it all, it helps us, and we're thinking as decision makers, continue to educate me. You all who are very intelligent, continue to educate us. Come to the table with some really cool models that will indicate for me, this is a definition, this is how we quantify urgent athleticism. It's something that I'm very, very interested in. That will help us make decisions, eventually become a Super Bowl champion. But I think this wave of coaches and decision makers are a lot more obviously open to it. They don't have the experience that Bill has, obviously. So I think we're trying to use as much as we can to make the right decisions. Marginal gains, that whole idea.
Yeah, I don't believe Bill Belichick. But and he doesn't. He tells you what he wants you to believe, right? I mean, so, but he's brilliant. A ton of respect for his mind. He doesn't maybe need all the analytics. He comes to the right decision, with the wetware, as Sandy put it. But for those of us who don't have the brilliant football mind that he does, maybe we need analytics. And one of the things that's interesting in that quote is you can kind of see what I was mentioning before. He sees analytics as scouting tendencies, right? So on third and short, this is what this team, they tend to run right, So he has a very solid coach's perspective of what analytics can do for a coach, and he can also. But there's so much more than for roster construction and those sorts of things as well. So no, I don't believe him, but he probably doesn't need it as much as some other teams do.
We have about 5 more minutes till we'll get to some questions, from the audience. There's two other things I definitely want us to get to. And Sandy, one of the things you had talked about was how the analytics are sort of marrying up with the traditional scouting. Mm-hmm. We talked a little bit about that, and I was hoping you could expound upon that, how some of that information is helping the traditional scouts, and in turn, the traditional scouts help maybe, you. It's sort of, you work together.
Right. I don't know how much individual scouts are looking at stuff, but, there's definitely, there are scouts, when you hear them reading their reports, they've clearly put more attention into looking at, what the guy, I said stats as an analytics, but, looking at what these things are. And you can hear guys in their reports say things that, I wasn't in those rooms 5 years ago or 10 years ago, but were they quite taking the same perspective? Thomas would definitely have a better perspective on that than I would. But it's the scouts building rapport with the the people in the building, right? The guys at the Rams, they have the nerds nest, right? And there's the three really sharp people in there, and they are right next door to the scouting department. So the scouts, which scouts are coming by and spending time in there? I mean, when I visit there, I hear heard conversations between the pro scouting director and those guys that blew me away. I mean, pro scouting director using terms that sounded like a database query. He wasn't writing SQL syntax, but like the words he was using, it was like, oh, that's the filter part and that's the summarization part, right? Like, and it was really powerful to hear. And like, well, these are just smart people who are realizing, they're realizing that there's resources that they can avail themselves of, take advantage of to make themselves better at their job. And those are the people who are going to be the next Thomas Dimitroff, right? They're going to be, not literally in Atlanta, of course, no, I don't mean that. But you know what I mean? Like, it's like, that, and I think that happens because smart people recognize, where they can be helped. We all want to get ahead, and, and people who don't want to get ahead, maybe they're fine. Bill Belichick doesn't need it, right? Okay, that's fine.
Take us to the future. Where are we headed? Because I think we're right now at an interesting point where there's a lot more data that's coming. Where is it going? Can teams do this themselves, or do they need to go outside and bring in help for all this stuff that's coming?
Warren Buffett has a quote about innovation. He said, first comes the innovators, then comes the imitators, and then comes the idiots. And then the idiots undo all the great things that the innovators did. And there's this constant narrative, and we keep going back to it, especially here at Sloan, where, hey, it's analytics, and it's us against the world, and it's us against the old school, and hey, that war's over, and we won. I mean, I just think that the future is going to be folks like Sandy working for teams who, there's these third-party vendors, and we see them out here offering mostly data. And so they're trying to sell data, and what they really need to do is sell insight, or sell ability to gain insight, not just data. So I think that's the future, is smart folks like Sandy working for teams, being able to filter through all these different vendors, trying to offer solutions to teams and say, no, these guys are worthwhile, these guys are not worthwhile, they're not worth our time, it's not helpful. So we're almost past the idiots phase now, and we're into the mature business part of the movement.
Great. So I have some questions here. We'll roll through them. If anyone wants to jump in, grab them. The first would be based on the analytics, and I know it might be hard to go back to this, but Super Bowl, Seahawks, Patriots, 2 seasons ago, should the Seahawks have run the ball? Sandy?
So the short answer is, I don't know. but there's an important point that I think I've heard some people write about, but like it gets missed a lot. And it's the kind of thing that the reason like a person like me is not the right person, I should not be in the booth to like advise on these things, because I'm not a football person. I don't see these things. But I remember talking to our guys in the booth in Baltimore about that play, and they were pointing out that like, look, they had the only amount of time they had, they had enough time to basically run one run play and one pass play. If you run it now, you lose the run pass option on the next down. So the defense knows that you have to pass on that play. And now you have let them take the whatever the probability of success on that play is, it's ticked down a little bit because you gave up that run pass option. And I remember one of the first analyses I did in Baltimore was put together some stuff, and I was looking at this, and he's like, oh, but there's a run pass option here. You've given up the option for that. And it's like, what? And it's like, understand it inherently, but I don't like inherently like pick it up without even thinking about it. And the football guys can do that. But so then, but are there analysts who are smart football people? There certainly are. The Broncos won the Super Bowl with Mitch in the booth, and Mitch is a former college quarterback, so he probably understands run pass option without thinking about it. I think the thing that people always lose track of in that Seahawks game was where they lost the game was when they used 2 timeouts earlier in that drive, one after the big long play where they didn't get down and get ready to run, and then there was another one where they were lined up with like 2 seconds left, and why didn't they snap the ball? I don't know. They must have had a reason not to snap the ball, but they wasted 2 timeouts earlier, and I think that's where they lost the game, not on that play.
I'll tell you real quick, you're in my wheelhouse here. So they shouldn't have passed, and it's not for the reason anybody thinks. And I agree with that analysis too. So pass plays result in penalties on the offense far more often, especially on the goal line, than run plays do. And on the goal line, penalties on the offense are penalties are asymmetric, right? So if the offense commits a penalty, you lose, you're on the 11, and that is a big difference. Being on the 11 compared to being on the goal line is enormous. Being at the 50 or being at your own 40, right, is tiny compared to that. So the 10 yards matter much more than 10 yards.
Smart guy.
A penalty on the defense only moves the ball 6 inches, right? So I put this situation through my simulator, and it kept coming up saying, you really don't want to pass if you can avoid it because of the
penalty.
asymmetry of that. Sacks as well kind of factor into that. There's a huge asymmetry to the situation, and those kind of tiny little things can make big differences in whether or not you're the Super Bowl champion, and they often get overlooked. And that's one of the things that analytics might be able to do that even maybe Bill Belichick can't do.
So,
John,
here we're talking about should they have run the ball? Should they have passed the ball? There's certain circumstances in a game where you need to pass the ball with 100% likelihood, or you need to run the ball with 100% likelihood. We're looking at these discrete outcomes, these realizations of random variables. The truth is, in that decision making, there's a distribution. And you can't say you should have passed with 100% likelihood, or you should have run with 100% likelihood. There's a distribution with which you should have done each. And this was a realization of that random process, and it happened to not turn out well. But if we do 1,000 samples of this, who knows what the optimal distribution is? You'd have to crunch the numbers, but it's not 100% one or the other. Or you did the numbers.
Right,
Is it? There's a distribution, right?
There's game theory. You can't always be totally predictable.
course.
But yeah, there's a heavy preference. You should lean away.
So there's a preference, but even with this preference, with this random distribution, sometimes you do the less preferred thing, just
keep them off balance.
randomly.
Game theory,
This is natural
But if you
mathematics at play
if you
here.
had 2 timeouts, wouldn't you have run the ball both times?
Well, with the 2 timeouts, now we have an easy decision.
Right, yeah, but it was
Yes.
1, and so
Yeah, of course.
it was
And
different.
how much is the personnel that's on the field part of that decision? And the reason I ask is, if I recall, the Seahawks had 3 receivers set on the field for that play. The Patriots defense matched with their goal line package. Remember the clip on NFL Films, Malcolm, go. Now, based on the matchup, they'd be, if you run there, you're not running in an advantageous matchup. So how much does that factor into the decision that we're talking about here? Isn't that part of the discussion too? And does that almost, I don't want to say let them off the hook, but say, well, that makes sense why they threw it in that situation. If they ran it, maybe we're looking at a situation like, Patriots-Colts 2003, where Edgerrin James gets tackled behind the line of scrimmage. So just another thing to add to the discussion from the football perspective. Here's another question, just to move it on. Which positions are most open to or can make the best use of analytics? Which positions are maybe the least? Can we look at a position that, stands out above the rest?
Well, offensive line is naturally the tough one. I mean, you work as a unit. How do you separate how one player performs as opposed to the guy next to him? A lot of times when they're working together, a lot of times when you don't know the offensive line's schemes, their exact goals, their techniques, it's very tough to get analytics on offensive linemen. And there's a lot of other positions where things are much more straightforward. Say kickers, punters, things where things are much more like set pieces.
No question, quarterback. It's a quarterback-driven league, and that's vitally important. And we look at everything. Same thing, talking about signing a guy to a massive contract. I think it's a huge discussion point we have. It doesn't end there. It's the most talked about position when you're really analyzing the need for a quarterback.
Is it the hardest?
I think it is the hardest.
Yeah.
It definitely is the hardest because there's an element that we can't measure, obviously the heart, which is if anyone else can figure out that, they can share it with me as well.
How about, and this ties into a little bit, I think, John, what you're talking about, how is the codependency of each player, accounted for in the analytics? I think that's offensive line. Oftentimes you're going to be working in concert with the player next to you. How much is that a factor?
It certainly ought to be in there, but as saying earlier, right? It's a question of well, what data do I have that I could use to interrogate that portion of the question? And, we talk about small sample sizes, now you start introducing interaction effects between things, and it's like, well, I don't have enough degrees of freedom to really do that. So you figure out ways to look into stuff like that, but there's no doubt it's a challenge, and but I mean, it's a challenge you have in basketball too, right? You got 5 guys on the floor and all these people, what's the right complementary skill set of players, right? Like, just it's a complicated question for sports analytics in general, and football is no different. It's just we have a paucity of data and sample size.
Also, naturally, let it be known that this is basketball taken to the extreme. When you have interaction of 5 players as opposed to 11, the order of magnitude changes completely.
Explodes. Yeah.
Explodes. This makes it significantly tougher.
Well, that's why we just treat you guys as one unit.
Yeah, exactly.
So you're giving all 5 guys $9 million a year now instead of just John.
No, that's his job.
Oh, it's his job.
So, someone who's come back to this panel multiple years asks the question, each year the same issues with the football stats come up with the small sample size. So is there another branch of math or economics that would be better, maybe game theory, when we talk about analytics?
That's up to
You
you.
guys.
Yeah, well, football is a zero-sum, 2-player game, and it's the game theory aspect to it is actually pretty simple, and those lessons have been learned, I think. We were just talking about the run-pass question, but to be able to, let's say, divine the perfect run-pass balance in certain situations, game theory would require us to know the full distribution of what would the payoffs be if the offense always ran and the defense always knew the offense was going to run, and so on and so on and so on. So game theory is not going to solve the small sample problem. I think the small sample problem, we have to approach it a different way. So one of the things is we take the baseball template, we take what the sabermetrics guys do, and we try to apply it on the football, and that just doesn't work, and sample size is one reason. So I think the solution is to take qualitative measures. So the human can look at the offensive line, and the offensive linemen themselves can parse apart individual contributions and interactions and so on, and you start with that. And that becomes an input. Those qualitative ratings and things can become an input into a football war. Wins above replacement for players.
I know. I would say that when you asked what is analytics, I said, well, it's about asking questions and answering those questions, right? And so, okay, if we don't have sample size, well, where can I help and which time of year, right? Okay, so it's draft time, right? So do we need to update the Massey Thaler draft model, or to compare it to the traditional Jimmy Johnson draft curve? Like, what can we do there? It's coming down to free agency. Can we help predict? Can we help predict who's going to get cut between the 90-man and the 53-man cut, so that this pro scouting staff can narrow their focus on who they're going to watch? Can we? Okay, it's getting towards free agency. Well, what can we say about contract structures, right? We don't have to work on football data to be of value to football decision makers, right? There's all kinds of different places in the business without even going on the business side of the building to figure out where there are other questions to answer, and sometimes there's not data, sometimes it's there's some backwards induction, something or other to help answer some other question.
And I think part of it is that you embrace the small sample, right? Like it's what happened over one game or one game's worth of plays or 16 games isn't always that meaningful, the Ravens, for example, you guys had a ton of injuries last year. That doesn't mean that you guys are going to be hurt every single year. It's just the reality of, in a small sample, things happen. And so you embrace it from that perspective, and you don't treat what you saw as the most obvious and consistent value, and you have a broader sample to work with that, you treat as more meaningful, and you actually embrace it in a strange way.
Can I make one more comment? About this small sample size, I want to clarify. The sample size is too small to really verify things that we do in practice to a good degree, but I don't think the sample size is too small at all to make predictions. I think we can make lots of good predictions, lots of good models. The problem is when you use these models and these predictions to see the results and to see if the results match to what expectations you think, that's where the small sample size can
right. Well, and that's
cause
the
a
stuff
big
Nate's
problem.
talking about with
Yeah,
elections,
of course.
right? He's
Yeah.
got a sample size of 8. right? Like
Yeah.
in terms of certain parts of it.
But the game tree, that's tough when you start building. You don't have enough sample size for that.
So a lot of great perspectives. We've run out of time, but I want to thank John, Brian, Sandy, Bill, Thomas. Thank you for being here. Great panel.